I want you to picture something that doesn't make sense. A British officer charging into Nazi machine gun fire, not with a rifle, not with a grenade, but with a bow and arrow, a weapon that hadn't seen real combat in 500 years. And here's what nobody tells you about that morning in France: it worked. The German patrol never heard the shot, never saw the muzzle flash. They just watched their commander collapse with a medieval arrow through his chest, and in that moment of complete disbelief, while their brains struggled to process what their eyes were seeing, that's when the real attack began. Because Mad Jack Churchill understood something that every modern military had forgotten. Wars aren't won by the best weapons. They're won by breaking the enemy's mind. And I'm about to show you exactly how he did it. But first, let me tell you what happened. 30 seconds before that arrow flew, when those 5 German soldiers were still laughing, still moving forward, still absolutely certain they were invincible. It's May 1940, and the entire British Expeditionary Force is collapsing. France is falling faster than anyone predicted, and everywhere you look, British soldiers are burning documents, abandoning equipment, running toward Dunkirk. Because the German war machine isn't just winning, it's rewriting every rule of combat. Their blitzkrieg doctrine is simple: move faster than the enemy can think, hit harder than they can respond. Never give them time to recover, and it's working devastatingly. Working Poland crushed in 27 days, Norway overwhelmed Denmark, taken in hours. France, the greatest military power in Europe, is bleeding out, and everyone knows it. Everyone except one man. Jack Churchill is standing at a crossroads near Lepinette, watching the retreat flow past him, and he's thinking about something strange. He's thinking about fear. Not his own fear, but theirs. The Germans, because Jack has seen something nobody else has noticed. The German soldiers are winning so decisively, so completely, that they've started to move with a specific kind of confidence, the confidence of men who believe nothing can surprise them anymore. And that confidence, Jack realizes, is a weapon waiting to be turned against them. See, Jack Churchill wasn't supposed to be in this war at all. He was a professional soldier. Yes, but his real passion was archery. He'd represented Britain in the World Archery Championships. He'd worked as a male model in Nairobi. He'd played bagpipes in military bands. He was eccentric, brilliant, unpredictable, and absolutely convinced that modern warfare had made one fatal mistake. It had forgotten that soldiers are human beings, and human beings don't just respond to firepower. They respond to fear, confusion, belief, and the complete violation of expectation. So when Jack sees that German patrol moving down the road that morning, 5 men, rifles slung casually, talking among themselves, moving like they own France, because in a very real sense, they do. He doesn't reach for a rifle. He reaches for his longbow. And this is where the story gets interesting, because what happens next isn't just about killing one German soldier. It's about what happens inside the minds of the other 4. Jack draws the bow. The arrow is medieval ash, wood steel tip, designed to punch through armor, the kind of arrow that killed French knights at Agincourt in 1415. He aims not at the closest target, but at the squad leader, the man in front, the man the others follow, and he releases. There's no sound, no muzzle flash, no crack of gunfire, just the whisper of feathers cutting air. And then the German officer stops moving, just stops like someone pressed pause. He looks down at his chest where 30 inches of arrow shaft is protruding from his uniform, and his brain cannot process this information because it violates everything he knows about war. His training told him to fear bullets, shells, grenades, gas. But nobody trained him for this. And in the 3 seconds it takes for him to fall, the other 4 German soldiers experience something that will ripple through the entire Wehrmacht for the rest of the war. They experience doubt, not just fear. Doubt about what's real, about what's possible, about whether the rules they've been following still apply. One of them actually says out loud in German, "What the hell was that?" Not who shot him, not where's the enemy, but what happened. Because the human brain, when confronted with something it can't categorize, doesn't go to fear. First it goes to confusion, and Jack Churchill understood that confusion is a weapon more lethal than any rifle, because a confused enemy doesn't shoot back, doesn't take cover, doesn't call for support. He freezes, and freezing in combat is death. By the time those 4 soldiers process what happened, by the time they raise their rifles and start scanning for threats, Jack's commandos have already opened fire from 3 different positions, and the entire patrol is down. But here's what matters more than that: single engagement. Here's what changes everything. One of those German soldiers survives, wounded. He crawls back to his lines and he tells the story, and the story spreads like poison through the German ranks. Because soldiers talk. Soldiers always talk. And when they hear that story about the British officer with the bow and arrow, their first reaction is laughter. It has to be propaganda, British morale building nonsense, because who would bring a bow to a gunfight? Who would be that insane? But then the story gets confirmed. Then more reports come in. Then patrols start finding arrows. Not bullets, arrows, and dead German soldiers. And the laughter stops. Because now they're facing something worse than a dangerous enemy. They're facing an incomprehensible one, and incomprehensible enemies are terrifying in ways that normal enemies aren't. Let me explain why this matters. In modern warfare, there's a concept called the OODA loop, Observe, Orient, Decide Act. It's how soldiers process threats. You see the enemy, you identify what they are. You decide on a response, you act, and the side that completes this loop faster wins firefights. When Jack Churchill uses a longbow, he doesn't just kill a man, he breaks the orient phase of that loop. Because when a German soldier sees his commander with an arrow in his chest, his brain cannot orient, it cannot fit this observation into any known category of threat. Medieval weapon, British commando, 1940. France, these things don't compute. And while his brain is struggling to reconcile impossible data, while he's stuck in orientation paralysis, that's when he dies. This is why militaries throughout history have feared unconventional warriors more than conventional ones. A conventional enemy you can train against, you can prepare for, you can predict, but an enemy who operates outside your framework of expectations, that enemy lives in your head, rent-free, and Jack Churchill was about to take up permanent residence in the German High Command's nightmares after Dunkirk, after the evacuation. When everyone else came home defeated, Jack came home energized because he'd proven something that the modern British Army had forgotten, that small units using unconventional tactics could achieve effects far beyond their size, and the British military desperately needed effects, because they had just lost an entire army's worth of equipment in France. So, when Churchill volunteered for the newly formed commandos, the special forces units designed for raids and psychological warfare, they didn't just accept him, they made him a troop commander. And Jack did something brilliant. He didn't just bring his longbow and his sword, he brought his philosophy. He trained his men not just in weapons and tactics, but in psychology. He taught them that their job wasn't to kill Germans. Their job was to make Germans afraid to be killed. And there's a massive difference between those two missions. In December 1941, Jack Churchill leads a raid on Vågsøy, Norway. The objective is to destroy fish oil factories that the Germans are using for explosives. The expected approach would be a quiet infiltration, a sabotage withdrawal. Instead, Jack does something nobody expects. He orders his bagpiper to play as they hit the beach, and suddenly German defenders who were prepared for gunfire, who were trained to respond to explosions, who knew exactly how to fight a commando raid, are hearing Scottish war music echoing off frozen rocks at dawn. And their OODA loop breaks again, because this doesn't fit the pattern. This isn't how British commandos operate. This isn't how modern war sounds. And in that moment of confusion while they're trying to understand what's happening, Jack's men are already inside their positions, already killing, already moving. The raid is a complete success. But more importantly, the psychological report afterwards reveals something fascinating. German prisoners, when interrogated, mention the music more than the combat. They describe it as terrifying, as supernatural, as something that made them feel like they were fighting ghosts, not soldiers. And that's when Jack Churchill becomes more than a soldier. He becomes a legend, a ghost story that German soldiers tell each other in trenches, a name that appears in intelligence reports with words like unorthodox, dangerous, unpredictable, a problem that can't be solved with conventional tactics. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because Jack Churchill's methods start spreading. Other commando units start adopting unconventional tactics, not bows and swords necessarily, but the philosophy behind them, the idea that you can defeat an enemy's mind before you ever defeat his body. And this philosophy achieves something remarkable. It forces the Germans to divert resources, not to fight the British Army, but to defend against a handful of commandos in Sicily. In 1943, Jack Churchill and 6 men capture 42 Italian soldiers, not through firepower, but through sheer psychological dominance. He walks up to a defensive position, sword drawn, bagpipes playing, and demands surrender. and they surrender because in that moment they believe they're facing someone who cannot be reasoned with, someone who plays by different rules, someone who might actually be insane enough to charge a fortified position with a medieval sword. And when you believe that, when you think your enemy might be genuinely unhinged, the rational response is survival. Not heroism, but the story that really explains Jack Churchill, the story that shows you how completely he understood psychological warfare happens in Yugoslavia. In 1944, Jack is leading a commando force supporting partisan fighters when they're ambushed by a much larger German force. His men are pinned down, outgunned. The situation is desperate, and Jack Churchill does something that still baffles military historians. He orders his bagpiper to play. Well, yeah, no come back again, a Scottish folk song, right there in the middle of a firefight. The Germans stop shooting, not because they want to, but because they can't process what's happening. They can hear the music, which means the British are still alive, still fighting, still confident enough to play music. And that confidence is more intimidating than any amount of return fire, because confidence suggests reserves, suggests backup, suggests that maybe this isn't a desperate last stand. Maybe it's a trap. And in that moment of hesitation, Jack's force breaks contact and escapes. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered why this story isn't more famous? Why Mad Jack Churchill isn't as well known as other World War II heroes? And the answer is uncomfortable. It's because his methods work too well. Because if you're a military organization trying to project power, trying to maintain discipline, trying to run a modern professional army, the last thing you want to celebrate is a guy who proved that all your expensive equipment, all your doctrine, all your training could be outmatched by one man with medieval weapons and a deep understanding of human psychology. But here's what you need to understand, and this is important. This is the part that changes how you see, not just this story, but all of military history. Jack Churchill's weapons weren't really the bow and the sword. Those were just tools. The real weapon was always doubt. He weaponized the gap between expectation and reality. He turned the Germans' own training against them, because modern soldiers are trained to respond to modern threats. And when you introduce a pre-modern threat into that environment, you create a cognitive dissonance that's more disruptive than any explosive. And if you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, if you're realizing that there's so much more to World War II than the battles we learned about in school, then do me a favor, hit that subscribe button right now. Because every single week I bring you stories like this, stories about the individuals, the tactics, the moments that changed everything. Stories that reveal the human side of history, the psychological warfare, the impossible decisions. And I promise you, there are dozens more stories about World War II that will completely change how you understand that war. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's keep exploring these incredible true stories together. Now back to Jack Churchill, because we're about to get to the part where his legend becomes something else entirely, where the man who mocked death with medieval weapons finally meets his match in 1944. Jack is captured in Yugoslavia after that bagpipe escape. I mentioned his luck finally runs out. He's wounded, surrounded, and taken prisoner, and here's where you'd expect the story to end. Right? German captured British commando officer, famous for killing Germans with arrows. Clearly this man is going to be executed. But something strange happens. The German officers who interrogate him are fascinated, not angry. Fascinated because Jack Churchill has become something rare in World War II. He's become a soldier that both sides respect. His captors ask him about the bow, about the sword, about the tactics. And Jack, being Jack, answers honestly because he understands something else about psychology. When you've already established yourself as fearless, already proven you don't follow normal rules, you can afford to be honest, because honesty from a man like that feels like another form of dominance. They send him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, one of the most brutal camps in the Nazi system, reserved for special prisoners, political enemies, intelligence officers, people. The Reich wants to disappear, and Jack Churchill immediately starts planning his escape, because of course he does. In September 1944, he escapes with a Royal Air Force officer. They make it to the Baltic coast before being recaptured. And here's the insane part when they bring him back. The camp commandant is almost impressed because escaping Sachsenhausen wasn't supposed to be possible, so they send him to a different camp in Austria, a camp in the Tyrol, and in April 1945, with the war collapsing around Germany, with the Reich in its Final death throes, Jack Churchill escapes. Again this time, he just walks out during the confusion of the German retreat, and he walks 140 miles through enemy territory back to Allied lines. And when he arrives, the war in Europe is over, finished, the Germans have surrendered, and Jack Churchill's reaction to this news is famous. He says, if it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept this war going another 10 years. Which sounds like a joke, and maybe it partly is, but it also reveals something true about Jack Churchill. He didn't fight because he hated Germans. He fought because he loved the fight, because he understood himself in war in a way that peacetime could never offer. And when the atomic bombs fell on Japan, when World War II finally truly ended, Jack Churchill volunteered to keep fighting. He went to Burma. He served in Palestine. He refused to accept that the age of the warrior was over. But here's the thing. It was over the world that Jack Churchill understood the world, where individual courage and unconventional thinking could change battles. That world was ending. Technology was taking over. Wars would be fought with missiles and tanks and aircraft, and eventually computers and drones, and the kind of warfare that Jack Churchill practiced. The personal, psychological, intimate warfare was becoming obsolete, except it wasn't really obsolete, was it? Because here we are, 80 years later, and we're still telling his story. We're still fascinated by the man who brought a bow to a gunfight and won. We're still asking ourselves, how did he survive? How did it work? And the answer is the same answer. It's always been, he survived because he understood that war isn't really about weapons. It's about will. It's about who can impose their reality on the other person. And Jack Churchill's reality was so strong, so unshakable, so utterly convinced of itself that even the Wehrmacht couldn't break it. Let me tell you what happened to those German patrols after 1940, after the stories about the British officer with the bow spread through their ranks. They started changing their behavior, they started being more cautious in certain areas, they started scanning tree lines differently, they started reporting unusual activity more frequently. And all of these tiny behavioral changes came from one man with one medieval weapon who understood that the human mind is the ultimate battlefield. Military historians have a term for this force: multiplication. It's when a small unit achieves effects far beyond its size. But Jack Churchill took force multiplication to a completely different level because he didn't multiply through firepower. He multiplied through fear, through doubt, through the psychological weight of unpredictability. And you can see this principle playing out throughout military history. In every era, the warriors who become legendary aren't usually the ones with the best equipment. They're the ones who understand something deeper about human nature. The Spartans at Thermopylae didn't win through superior weapons, they won through superior psychology. The reputation that preceded them, the fear they inspired. Genghis Khan conquered half the world, not just through cavalry tactics, but through a reputation for absolute mercilessness that made cities surrender without fighting. And Jack Churchill, in his own smaller way, tapped into that same ancient truth, that what you make the enemy believe matters more than what you make the enemy suffer. So when I tell you that they mocked his medieval weapon until the front line fell silent, I'm not just talking about one battle or one engagement. I'm talking about the cumulative effect of a man who refused to fight the war. Everyone else was fighting, who refused to accept that modern warfare had all the answers, who looked at the most technologically advanced military in the world and thought, I can beat them with a bow because they won't know how to process it. And he was right. They didn't know how to process it. They couldn't fit him into their doctrine, couldn't prepare for him, couldn't predict him, and in the end, that made him more dangerous than entire battalions. Because battalions you can target, you can plan against, you can defeat. But how do you defeat an idea? How do you train soldiers to respond to something that shouldn't exist? And that's the final lesson of Mad Jack Churchill's story. The lesson that every military, every organization, every person should understand. The most powerful weapon isn't the most advanced weapon. It's the weapon your enemy isn't prepared for. It's the tactic that breaks their assumptions. It's the move that makes them question everything they thought they knew. And if you can do that, if you can get inside their decision-making process, if you can make them hesitate, doubt, second-guess themselves, then you've already won, because wars aren't won when the enemy is destroyed. They're won when the enemy stops believing they can win, and Jack Churchill with his bow, his sword, and his bagpipes made German soldiers stop believing. Not in Germany, not in the war, but in their own ability to predict and control the battlefield around them. That's why the front line fell silent. Not because Jack Churchill killed everyone on it, but because he made them afraid to move, afraid that the next impossible thing might be waiting just ahead, afraid that the rules they had relied on had stopped working, and fear like that spreads faster than any order, travels farther, than any bullet lasts longer than any battle. Now, I want to leave you with something to think about, because Jack Churchill's story isn't just history. It's a lesson that applies today in business, in competition, in life. Everyone is fighting the same fight. Everyone is using the same weapons, the same tactics, the same playbook. And because of that, success goes to the people who are just slightly better at the standard approach. But every so often, someone comes along who completely ignores the standard approach, who brings something nobody expects, who breaks the pattern so completely that everyone else has to stop and recalibrate. And those people, the pattern breakers, the rule benders, the ones who make you question your assumptions. They don't just win, they change the game entirely. Jack Churchill changed the game. He proved that the past isn't obsolete, that ancient weapons and ancient wisdom still have power in a modern world, that psychology matters more than technology, and that one man with absolute conviction can achieve more than 1,000 men following orders. So the next time someone tells you that's not how it's done, the next time someone mocks your unconventional approach, the next time you're tempted to abandon what makes you different and just follow the playbook, remember Mad Jack Churchill. Remember the man they laughed at until the front line fell silent, and ask yourself, what would happen if I stopped fighting their war and started fighting mine? If this story changed how you think about strategy, about history, about what's possible, then I need you to do something right now. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video, because there are hundreds more stories like this, stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things, stories about moments that changed history, stories that will change how you see the world. And I'm going to keep bringing them to you every single week, but I can only do that if you're here. So, subscribe right now, and let's keep exploring the untold stories of World War II together, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what we can learn from it. And Mad Jack Churchill has a lot to teach us. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.